The bullet that killed Sarah Bennett's husband passed so close to her face that she could feel the heat of it. And in the half-second before she understood what had happened, she thought perhaps it was just another Arizona storm rolling in across the desert. It was June of 1878, and the town of Prescott sat in the high country where the ponderosa pines grew tall and the air carried the scent of juniper and sage. Sarah had come west with Thomas 3 years prior, following his dream of striking silver in the territories. They had been walking back from the assayer's office when the shot rang out, a dispute over a claim that Thomas had filed on behalf of another miner, a man too sick to make the journey into town himself. The shooter disappeared into the crowd before anyone could stop him, and Thomas died in Sarah's arms in the dusty street, his blood soaking into the red earth while strangers stood in a circle around them, helpless and silent. She was 24 years old and suddenly alone in a territory that showed no mercy to women without protection. The small cabin they had rented sat 3 miles outside of town, accessible only by a rough trail that wound through the cedar breaks and rocky outcroppings. Sarah had no family back east, no money to book passage on a stage, and winter would come eventually to these mountains despite the summer heat that currently baked the landscape. The funeral was a simple affair. The preacher said words that Sarah did not hear, and the men from the mining camp lowered Thomas into the ground on a hillside where wildflowers grew between the graves. She stood in her black dress, the only fine thing she owned, and felt the sun beating down on her head through the thin veil. Someone pressed a handkerchief into her hand. Someone else offered condolences that evaporated in the dry air before they could reach her grief-numbed mind. When it was over, she walked back to the cabin alone, refusing the offers of escort from men whose eyes held either pity or something worse. The 3-mile journey took her 2 hours because she had worn her good boots, the leather ones that pinched her toes, and by the time she reached the cabin door, blisters had formed on both heels. She sat on the steps Thomas had built from pine logs and let the tears come finally, great racking sobs that shook her whole body and scared the ravens from the nearby trees. That night, she lay in the bed she had shared with her husband and stared at the ceiling beams he had cut and fitted himself. The cabin was solid, well built, one room with a sleeping loft and a stone fireplace that Thomas had mortared with clay from the creek bed. He had been a good man, kind and gentle, and she had loved him in the comfortable way of people who had grown up in the same Pennsylvania town and always known they would marry. But there had never been passion between them, never the wild romance the dime novels described, just steady companionship and the shared dream of building something in this new territory. Now the dream was dead along with the dreamer, and Sarah had to decide what came next. The money ran out after 3 weeks. She sold Thomas's tools, his rifle, his pocket watch, everything of value except her wedding ring and the small locket that held a curl of her mother's hair. It bought her 2 months of beans and flour and enough kerosene to keep the lamp burning. She took in mending from the women in town, sewing late into the night by lamplight until her eyes burned and her fingers bled from the needle pricks. It was not enough. August came, and with it the afternoon thunderstorms that built over the mountains and swept through the valleys with dramatic fury. Sarah was walking back from town one afternoon, her arms full of mending she had picked up from the general store, when she saw the storm building in the west. The clouds were purple-black and towering, and she could see the rain falling in gray sheets miles away. She quickened her pace, knowing she would never make it to the cabin before the storm hit. The first drops fell when she was still a mile from home, fat and heavy, carrying the smell of creosote and wet earth. Then the sky opened up and the world turned to water. Within seconds, she was soaked through, her dress clinging to her body, the wrapped bundle of mending growing heavy with rain despite the oilcloth she had covered it with. The trail turned to mud beneath her feet and she slipped, going down hard on one knee, the mending flying from her arms and landing in a puddle. She knelt there in the mud and rain, watching the water soak through the oilcloth and ruin hours of work, and she felt something break inside her chest. She had been strong for weeks, had held herself together through the funeral and the loneliness and the slow starvation of her bank account, but this was too much. She put her face in her hands and wept, her tears mixing with the rain, her shoulders shaking with sobs that the thunder drowned out. That was when she heard the horse. She looked up to see a rider coming through the rain, a man on a big bay gelding wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a long duster that shed water like duck feathers. He pulled the horse to a stop beside her and swung down from the saddle in one fluid motion. "Ma'am, you are going to catch your death out here," he said, and his voice was deep and carried a Texas drawl that stretched the vowels. He bent down and gathered up the soaked bundle of mending, then offered her his hand. Sarah looked up at him through the rain. He was tall and lean, with a face that was all angles and weathered skin, the kind of face that came from years in the sun and wind. His eyes were gray like the storm clouds, and when she took his hand, his grip was strong and calloused. He pulled her to her feet with easy strength. "I am fine," she said, but her voice shook with cold and shock. "No, ma'am, you are not," he said firmly. He whistled, and the bay horse came to his side, well-trained and patient in the storm. "Where are you headed?" "I have a cabin just up the trail," she said, pointing vaguely east. "Then I will see you there," he said. He swung back into the saddle, then reached down and offered his arm. "Come on up. Your cabin is my direction, and this storm is not letting up any time soon." Sarah hesitated. She had been warned about trusting strange men in the territories, about the dangers that waited for women who were not careful. But she was soaked and cold and exhausted, and the thought of walking another mile in the mud was more than she could bear. She took his arm and let him pull her up behind him. She sat side saddle on the horse's rump, clutching the stranger's coat to keep her balance, and he kicked the bay into a walk. The rain continued to pour down, and Sarah found herself pressed against the stranger's back, her face nearly touching his shoulder. Even through the wet wool of his duster she could smell him, leather and horse and something else, something clean and wild that she could not identify at first. Then it came to her, cedar and rain. He smelled like the cedar trees that grew in the breaks, like the rainstorms that swept through the mountains. It was an intoxicating scent, primal and honest, and she found herself breathing it in deeply despite herself. They reached the cabin just as the storm began to ease. The stranger helped her down from the horse, his hands on her waist, and she felt the strength in his grip even through her soaked clothing. He carried the ruined mending to the porch and set it down, then tipped his hat to her. "You get inside and get warm, ma'am," he said, "and you might want to hang those in front of the fire. Might be able to save some of them." "Thank you," Sarah said, and she meant it. "I am Sarah Bennett. My cabin is just here if you ever need anything." "Colt Brennan," he said, and he smiled for the first time. A slow smile that changed his whole face, made him look younger and less dangerous. "I work the McCready Ranch just over the ridge. I will remember your kindness, Mrs. Bennett." He swung back into the saddle and rode off into the thinning rain, and Sarah stood on the porch and watched him go until he disappeared into the trees. Only then did she realize he had called her Mrs. Bennett, had seen her wedding ring, and she felt a strange disappointment that she could not explain. That night she hung the mending in front of the fire as he had suggested and managed to save about half of it. The rest was ruined beyond repair, and she would have to explain to Miss Henderson at the general store what had happened. But as she worked, she kept thinking about the stranger, about Colt Brennan with his gray eyes and his Texas drawl, and the way he had smelled like cedar and rain. It troubled her that she was thinking about him at all. Thomas had been dead less than 2 months. She should be mourning, should be thinking only of her late husband, but instead she found herself remembering the strength of Colt's hands on her waist, the solid warmth of his back against her cheek, the clean, wild scent of him that had nothing to do with pomade or cologne, and everything to do with the land itself. She did not see him again for 2 weeks. September arrived, and the days stayed warm, but the nights grew cool, a reminder that winter was coming to the high country. Sarah had managed to keep herself fed through the mending work, but barely. She was growing thinner, her dresses hanging loose on her frame, and she knew she could not continue like this much longer. She needed to find better work, or she needed to leave Prescott entirely and try her luck somewhere else. The problem was that she had nowhere else to go. She was in town on a Saturday morning, delivering mending to Mrs. Henderson and trying not to think about how she would pay for the flour and beans she needed, when she saw Colt Brennan riding down the main street. He was with 3 other cowboys from the McCready Ranch, all of them dusty from the trail, and they tied their horses in front of the saloon and went inside. Sarah told herself to keep walking, to mind her own business, and not think about the man who had helped her in the rain. But her feet carried her past the saloon, and she found herself glancing through the swinging doors, catching a glimpse of Colt standing at the bar, his hat pushed back on his head, laughing at something one of his companions had said. He looked up at that moment, as if he had felt her gaze, and their eyes met across the space. Recognition lit his face, and he smiled, that same slow smile that transformed him. And Sarah felt her heart do something strange in her chest. She quickly looked away and hurried on down the street, her cheeks burning. She was nearly to the general store when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her. "Mrs. Bennett," Colt's voice called, and she stopped, took a breath, then turned to face him. He had followed her out of the saloon, leaving his friends behind, and he stood there in the morning sunlight with his thumbs hooked in his belt, looking at her with those gray storm cloud eyes. "Mr. Brennan," she said, trying to keep her voice steady and polite. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said. "After the storm, I mean. I have been thinking about you, wondering if you managed to save any of that mending." "I saved some of it," she said. "Thank you for your help that day. I do not know what I would have done without it." "You would have walked home in the rain and survived," he said simply. "You strike me as a survivor, Mrs. Bennett." There was something in the way he said it, not condescending or pitying, just matter of fact, and Sarah found herself smiling despite herself. "I am trying to be," she admitted. They stood there for a moment, an awkward silence stretching between them. Sarah knew she should excuse herself and continue on to the store, but she found she did not want to. She wanted to keep standing here in the sunlight, talking to this man who smelled like cedar and rain. "Are you making out all right?" Colt asked finally, and his voice was gentle. "I heard about your husband. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Sarah said, and she was surprised to find that the words did not hurt as much as they had even a week ago. "I am managing. The mending work helps." "But it is not enough," Colt said, and it was not a question. Sarah felt her cheeks flush with shame. She did not want to admit how dire her situation was, did not want to seem like she was begging for charity. But something about the way Colt was looking at her with concern but not pity made her answer honestly. "No," she said quietly. "It is not enough." Colt nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer. He looked away down the street, his jaw working as if he was thinking something through. Then he looked back at her. "The McCready Ranch is looking for someone to help out at the main house," he said. "Mrs. McCready is getting on in years, and she needs help with the cooking and cleaning. It would be steady work, good pay, and you could still live in your cabin if you wanted. The ranch is not far from there." Sarah stared at him. "You are offering me a job?" "I am telling you about one," Colt said. "What you do with the information is up to you. But if you're interested, I could ride out to your place tomorrow and take you to meet Mrs. McCready." Sarah's mind raced. Steady work meant steady money, meant she could keep the cabin, meant she could survive the winter. But it also meant she would be working at the ranch where Colt Brennan was employed, would likely see him regularly. And the thought of that made her feel things she should not be feeling so soon after Thomas's death. But what choice did she have? "That would be very kind of you," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Brennan." "Colt," he said. "Just Colt." "Colt," she repeated, and his name felt strange and intimate on her tongue. "And you can call me Sarah." He smiled again, that transformative smile, and tipped his hat to her. "I will see you tomorrow then, Sarah? Around noon?" "I will be ready," she said. He nodded and walked back toward the saloon, and Sarah continued on to the general store, her heart beating faster than it should have been. She told herself it was just the excitement of possibly having steady work, of having a solution to her problems. But she knew it was more than that. She knew it had to do with the way Colt Brennan looked at her, the way he said her name, the way he had thought about her enough to remember she needed help. That night, she lay in bed and thought about Cedar and rain, and she did not feel guilty for it. Colt arrived at noon the next day, riding the same bay gelding. Sarah had done her best to make herself presentable, had washed and pressed her second-best dress, had pinned her dark hair up in a neat bun. She felt his eyes on her as she stepped out onto the porch, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "You look nice," he said simply, and the compliment, delivered without flourish or exaggeration, meant more than any flowery words could have. "Thank you," she said. He helped her up onto the horse, and this time she rode in front of him, sitting side saddle across his lap, his arm around her waist to steady her. It was much more intimate than riding behind him had been, and Sarah was acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched. She could feel the warmth of him through her dress, could hear his steady breathing, could smell that scent of cedar and rain that seemed to cling to his skin. They rode in silence for a while, following a trail that wound through stands of ponderosa pine and open meadows where cattle grazed. The McCready Ranch was larger than Sarah had realized, thousands of acres of good grazing land in the mountain valleys. The main house came into view as they crested a ridge, a sprawling structure built of logs and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around three sides. "How long have you worked here?" Sarah asked, partly to break the silence and partly because she genuinely wanted to know more about him. 5 years, Colt said. "I came up from Texas after the war. Did some cattle drives, some range riding before I settled here. Mr. McCready is a good man to work for. Fair, honest, treats his men right." "And you are happy here?" Sarah asked. She felt him shift slightly behind her, and when he answered, his voice was thoughtful. "As happy as I reckon I know how to be. The work is good, the country is beautiful, but it is a lonely life sometimes being a cowboy, always moving, never putting down roots." "You could settle down," Sarah said. "Buy your own land, start your own ranch." "Maybe," Colt said, "if I found the right reason to." There was something in his tone that made Sarah's heart skip, and she did not dare ask what he meant by that. They arrived at the main house and Colt helped her down from the horse. A woman appeared on the porch, tall and gray-haired with a kind face lined with years of hard work and mountain sun. This was Eliza McCready, and she welcomed Sarah warmly. "Colt told me about you," Mrs. McCready said, taking Sarah's hands in her own. "I am so sorry about your husband, dear. This country is not easy on anyone, and it is especially hard on women." "Thank you," Sarah said, already liking this woman who spoke plainly and without false sentiment. They went inside and Mrs. McCready showed Sarah around the house. It was larger than it had appeared from outside, with multiple bedrooms upstairs, a big kitchen with a cast-iron stove, and a dining room that could seat 20 people. Mrs. McCready explained that she and her husband often hosted gatherings for the other ranchers in the area, and that preparing for these events was becoming too much for her to manage alone. "I need someone who can cook for a crowd, who can clean and do laundry, and who is not afraid of hard work," Mrs. McCready said. "In return, I will pay you $30 a month, plus meals when you are here, and you can keep living in your own cabin if you prefer. The work would be 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, from dawn until supper is cleaned up." $30 a month was more money than Sarah had seen since Thomas died. It was enough to live on, to save a little, to stop worrying about every penny spent on flour and beans. "I would be honored to work for you," Sarah said. Mrs. McCready smiled and patted her hand. "Then we have an agreement. Can you start tomorrow?" "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said. Colt rode her back to the cabin that afternoon, and this time Sarah felt lighter, almost giddy with relief. She had work. She would survive. Winter could come and she would be ready for it. "Thank you," she said to Colt as he helped her down from the horse. "You saved my life, I think." "You would have found a way," Colt said, "but I'm glad I could help." He started to turn the horse to leave, then stopped and looked back at her. "Sarah, would it be all right if I called on you sometime, just to see how you're getting on with the work?" Sarah knew what he was really asking. She knew that calling on someone meant courting, meant a declaration of interest that went beyond simple friendship. She should say no. Thomas had been dead for less than 3 months. It was too soon. People would talk. But when she looked at Colt Brennan sitting tall in the saddle with his gray eyes steady on hers, she found she did not care what people would say. "I would like that," she said softly. His face broke into that smile, and he nodded. "Next Sunday, then. I will bring some supplies from town if you need anything." "Just yourself," Sarah said, and then blushed at her own boldness. Colt's smile widened, and he tipped his hat to her before riding off into the golden afternoon light. Sarah started work at the McCready Ranch the next morning. The work was hard but satisfying, and Mrs. McCready was patient and kind, teaching Sarah how to manage the big kitchen, how to plan meals for the ranch hands who came in for supper several times a week, how to organize the cleaning and laundry. Sarah found she had a knack for it, and she enjoyed the rhythm of the work, the satisfaction of seeing a job well done. She saw Colt at the ranch most days, catching glimpses of him as he came in from the range or worked in the corrals near the barn. Sometimes their eyes would meet across the yard and he would touch the brim of his hat in greeting, and Sarah would feel that strange flutter in her chest. Other times he would come into the kitchen when she was working, ostensibly to get a cup of coffee or a biscuit, but really just to talk to her for a few minutes before heading back out to work. Those brief conversations became the highlights of Sarah's days. She learned that Colt was 27 years old, that he had fought for Texas in the war and lost his father and older brother in the same battle, that he had spent years drifting afterward before finding his way to Arizona. She learned that he loved this high country, the way the mountains turned purple at sunset and the way the storms rolled through in summer. She learned that he was thoughtful and intelligent, that he read when he had time, that he had a dry sense of humor that made her laugh, and she learned that she was falling in love with him, which terrified her. Sunday came, and Colt arrived at her cabin in the afternoon as promised. He brought flour and sugar and coffee from town, supplies that Sarah insisted on paying for even though he tried to refuse her money. They sat on the porch and drank coffee and talked for hours about everything and nothing. Colt told her stories about growing up in Texas, about working cattle drives and sleeping under the stars. Sarah told him about Pennsylvania, about her quiet childhood in a small town, about how she had always dreamed of adventure but never imagined it would look like this. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Colt stood to leave. He hesitated on the porch steps, looking back at Sarah with an expression she could not quite read. "I have been thinking about something," he said slowly, "and I hope you will not take offense." "What is it?" Sarah asked. "That day in the storm," Colt said, "when I helped you onto my horse. You smelled like cedar and rain, and I have never recovered from either." Sarah felt her breath catch. No one had ever said anything like that to her before, anything so poetic and honest and raw. "Colt," she whispered, but she did not know what else to say. He took a step toward her, then stopped himself. "I know it is too soon. I know you are still grieving. But I want you to know that I have feelings for you, Sarah. Real feelings. And when you are ready, if you ever are ready, I will be here." He left before she could respond, and Sarah stood on the porch and watched him ride away into the twilight. She put her hand over her heart and felt it racing beneath her palm. She knew she should feel guilty, should feel like she was betraying Thomas's memory. But instead, she felt alive for the first time in months, felt like something inside her that had been dormant was waking up. The weeks passed and autumn deepened. The aspen trees turned gold on the mountainsides, and the nights grew cold enough to require a fire. Sarah settled into her work at the ranch and into the pattern of her life. She looked forward to Sundays, when Colt would come to visit, and to the brief moments during the week when they could talk in the kitchen or the yard. She began to think of him constantly, to anticipate his arrival, to feel disappointed when circumstances kept him away. Mrs. McCready noticed, of course. Women always notice these things. "Colt is a good man," she said to Sarah one afternoon as they were working in the kitchen together, preparing for a dinner party the McCreadys were hosting for the neighboring ranchers. "One of the best I've ever known." Sarah felt her cheeks flush. "Yes, he seems very kind. He has had feelings for you since the day he first saw you," Mrs. McCready continued, rolling out pie dough with practiced efficiency. "He told my husband so, said he had never met a woman like you before." "Mrs. McCready," Sarah said, not sure where this conversation was heading. The older woman looked at her with kind but knowing eyes. "You are worried about what people will think. About how soon it is after your husband's death." Sarah nodded, relieved to have someone put words to her confusion. "People will always talk," Mrs. McCready said firmly. "That is what people do, but you cannot live your life based on what others think. You are young. You have your whole life ahead of you. Thomas Bennett was a good man, and I am sure you loved him. But he is gone, and you are still here, and you deserve to be happy." "I do not know if I can be happy again," Sarah admitted. "Not after everything that has happened." "Happiness is not something that happens to you," Mrs. McCready said. "It is something you choose, and sometimes it comes from the most unexpected places." That night, after the dinner party was over and the dishes were washed and Sarah was finally walking home in the darkness, she thought about Mrs. McCready's words. She thought about happiness as a choice, about the future instead of the past. And she thought about Colt Brennan, who had told her she smelled like cedar and rain and that he had never recovered from either. By the time she reached her cabin, she had made a decision. The next Sunday when Colt arrived for his visit, Sarah met him on the porch with her heart in her throat. "I need to tell you something," she said before she could lose her courage. Colt dismounted and walked to the porch steps, looking up at her with those steady gray eyes. "I am listening." "You said you had feelings for me," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. "And I have been thinking about that. About you. About us." She took a breath and continued. "Thomas was a good man, and I cared for him deeply. But I have to be honest. What I felt for him was comfortable and safe. It was not passionate. It was not the kind of love that keeps you awake at night or makes your heart race. And I think part of me always knew that, even though I never admitted it." Colt said nothing, just waited for her to continue. "But with you," Sarah said, "everything is different. I think about you constantly. I look forward to seeing you. When you are near me, I feel like I cannot breathe properly, and it terrifies me because it is everything I never felt before." She paused, then added softly, "You said I smelled like cedar and rain that day we met, but you should know that you did too, and I have never recovered from either." Colt's expression transformed, and in 2 long strides, he was on the porch, standing in front of her. He reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his palms rough and warm against her skin. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and intense, "I have been waiting to hear you say something like that since the moment I met you. Can I kiss you?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice, and Colt leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. It was nothing like kissing Thomas had been. This was fire and intensity, a kiss that made Sarah's knees weak and her heart pound so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She gripped the front of Colt's shirt and kissed him back with all the longing and fear and hope she had been holding inside for months. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Colt rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "I know it is fast and probably foolish, but I do." "I love you too," Sarah whispered, and saying the words felt like stepping off a cliff into open air, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. They spent the rest of the afternoon on the porch, sitting close together, holding hands and talking about the future. Colt told her he wanted to buy land of his own eventually, to build a ranch where they could raise cattle and horses and children. Sarah told him about her dreams of having a real home, a place where she belonged, a family to love and care for. As the sun set, Colt stood to leave, but this time he kissed her again before mounting his horse, a long, slow kiss that promised more to come. "I will talk to Mr. McCready tomorrow," he said, "about getting some time off. I want to court you properly, Sarah. I want everyone to know you are mine." "I want that too," Sarah said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. The courtship that followed was the talk of Prescott. Some people whispered that Sarah was moving on too quickly, that it was disrespectful to her late husband's memory. But most people saw what Sarah and Colt saw in each other, and they approved. Mrs. McCready became Sarah's champion, firmly shutting down any gossip she heard and reminding people that life was short in the territories and happiness should be grabbed with both hands whenever it appeared. Colt courted Sarah with old-fashioned determination. He took her on picnics in the meadows where wildflowers grew. He brought her books from town because he had noticed she liked to read. He fixed things around her cabin that needed repair, mending the roof and strengthening the porch steps and chopping enough firewood to last through the winter. He was patient and gentle and passionate all at once, and Sarah fell more in love with him every day. In November, as the first snow began to fall on the mountains, Colt asked Sarah to marry him. They were sitting by the fire in her cabin, and he got down on one knee in front of her, holding a simple gold band that he had bought with 2 months of wages. "I do not have much to offer you yet," he said, "just my heart and my hands and the promise that I will spend the rest of my life making you happy. But if you will have me, Sarah Bennett, I will be the most grateful man alive." Sarah looked at him. This man who had come into her life on a stormy afternoon and changed everything. She thought about how he smelled like cedar and rain, about how he had told her she was a survivor, about how he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I will marry you." Colt slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her, and outside the first snow of winter fell silently onto the pines. They were married 3 weeks later, on a cold December morning in the small church in Prescott. Sarah wore a new dress that Mrs. McCready had helped her make, pale blue wool with lace at the collar. Colt wore his best suit, and he could not stop smiling. Mr. and Mrs. McCready stood up as witnesses, and half the ranch hands from the McCready spread attended, along with many of the townspeople who had come to respect Sarah's quiet strength and Colt's steady character. The preacher said the words that bound them together, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Colt kissed Sarah with a tenderness that made several of the women in attendance dab at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The McCreadys hosted a reception at the ranch house with food and music and dancing. Sarah had never been much of a dancer, but Colt held her close and guided her through the steps, and she felt like she was floating. At one point during the evening, Mrs. McCready pulled her aside. "You made the right choice," the older woman said, squeezing Sarah's hand. "I can see it in your eyes. You're happy." "I am," Sarah said, and she was surprised by how true it was. "I never thought I could be again, but I am." That night, Colt carried Sarah over the threshold of her cabin, which was now their cabin. He had moved his things in during the week before the wedding, and seeing his belongings mixed with hers made everything feel real and permanent in a way that made Sarah's heart swell. They made love for the first time that night, and it was everything Sarah had never known she was missing. Colt was patient and passionate, taking his time to learn what she liked, showing her pleasure she had never experienced. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, and Sarah ran her fingers over the scars on Colt's chest, remnants of the war he rarely spoke about. "I never thought I would be this happy," she whispered in the darkness. Colt tightened his arms around her. "I will spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you stay this happy." "You do not have to do anything," Sarah said. "Just be here. Just be you. That is all I need." Winter settled over the high country, and Sarah and Colt adjusted to married life. They fell into an easy rhythm, with Sarah continuing to work at the McCready Ranch during the week and Colt working the range. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and read together, or Colt would tell stories about his younger days in Texas, or they would simply hold each other and listen to the wind in the pines outside. On Christmas Eve, The first real blizzard of the season hit, dumping 3 feet of snow on the mountains and making travel impossible. Sarah and Colt were snowed in at the cabin for 5 days, and they spent the time making love and talking and dreaming about their future. Colt told Sarah about a piece of land he had his eye on, a valley about 10 miles south of the McCready Ranch, with good grass and water and room to grow. "I've been saving my wages for years," he said, "and with what you are making now, we could have enough for a down payment by spring. We could build our own place, Sarah, start our own ranch." Sarah felt excitement bubble up in her chest. "Really? We could do that?" "We could do anything," Colt said, kissing her forehead. Together. When the snow finally melted enough for them to dig out, they made their way to the McCready Ranch to check in and make sure everyone had survived the storm. Mr. McCready pulled Colt aside while Sarah helped Mrs. McCready in the kitchen, and when they emerged, both men were smiling. "What is going on?" Sarah asked suspiciously. Colt took her hands in his. "Mr. McCready has offered to loan us the money for the land I want. Says he will take it out of my wages over the next 5 years, no interest. And he says you can keep working here for as long as you want, even after we move to our own place." Sarah looked at Mr. McCready, this gruff rancher who had been so kind to them both. "I do not know what to say." "Say you will make me proud," Mr. McCready said. "I have watched Colt work for 5 years, and he is one of the best men I have ever had on this ranch. And you, Sarah, are the best thing that ever happened to him. I want to see you both succeed." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, and she hugged the older man impulsively. "Thank you. Thank you so much." By the time spring arrived, the papers were signed and the land was theirs. Colt spent every spare moment clearing the site for the house, and Sarah helped when she could, dragging brush and stacking stones. They decided to build close to a creek that ran through the property where cottonwood trees grew tall, and there was natural shelter from the wind. The house went up slowly, built with logs that Colt cut and hauled himself, with stone for the foundation and fireplace that they gathered from the creek bed. Friends from the McCready Ranch came to help on weekends, and gradually the structure took shape. It would be bigger than Sarah's old cabin, with 2 rooms downstairs and a loft upstairs that could be divided into bedrooms eventually. "For the children," Colt said with a grin when Sarah asked about the extra space. Sarah blushed, but felt warmth spread through her chest. She had not told Colt yet, but she suspected she was already pregnant. Her monthly courses had not come in 6 weeks, and she had been feeling queasy in the mornings. She wanted to be sure before she said anything, but the thought of carrying Colt's child filled her with joy. In June, exactly 1 year after Thomas had died, Sarah stood at the window of their nearly completed house and looked out at the valley that was now their home. The wildflowers were in bloom, covering the meadows in carpets of yellow and purple and white. Cattle grazed in the distance, the small herd they had purchased with help from Mr. McCready. The mountains rose up on all sides, purple and majestic in the evening light. Colt came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "About how much has changed in 1 year," Sarah said. "About how different my life is now." "Better or worse?" Colt asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "So much better," Sarah said, turning in his arms to face him. "Colt, I need to tell you something." He looked down at her, his gray eyes suddenly serious. "What is it?" "I am pregnant," Sarah said, and saying the words out loud made them real in a way they had not been before. "We are going to have a baby." Colt's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and then pure joy. He let out a whoop and picked Sarah up, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "A baby?" he said wonderingly, setting her down gently. "Sarah, we are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Sarah asked, though she could see the answer written all over his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Colt said. He knelt down in front of her and placed his hands on her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. I am your father, and I promise I'm going to love you and your mother more than anything in this world." Sarah ran her fingers through Colt's dark hair, overwhelmed with emotion. This was her family now. This man who smelled like cedar and rain, this child growing inside her, this valley where wildflowers bloomed and cattle grazed and mountains touched the sky. She had lost so much, but she had gained so much more. The baby was born in January of 1880 during a cold snap that had ice forming on the inside of the windows. Sarah's labor lasted through the night, with Mrs. McCready and the local midwife attending her while Colt paced outside in the snow, too nervous to sit still. When the baby finally arrived at dawn, screaming and red-faced and perfect, the midwife carried him out to Colt. "You have a son," she said, placing the wrapped bundle in Colt's arms. Colt stared down at the baby, his face filled with wonder and terror and overwhelming love. "A son," he whispered. "Sarah gave me a son." They named him James, after Colt's father, who had died in the war. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes, and from the beginning he was healthy and strong and loud. Colt was completely besotted, spending hours just holding the baby and staring at him like he could not quite believe he was real. Sarah recovered quickly from the birth, and soon she was back to her routine, though now it included caring for a baby. She had stopped working at the McCready Ranch during the last months of her pregnancy, but Mrs. McCready came to visit often, bringing supplies and advice and the wisdom of a woman who had raised 5 children of her own. Life settled into a new pattern. Colt worked the ranch during the day, building their herd and improving the property. Sarah cared for James and kept the house and tended the kitchen garden she had planted near the creek. In the evenings, they would sit together as a family, and Colt would hold his son while Sarah read aloud from whatever book they were working through. "This is all I ever wanted," Colt said one evening, watching James sleep in his arms. "A family, a home, someone to love and work for." "You have it now," Sarah said softly. "We both do." The years passed, and the ranch prospered. Colt proved to have a good eye for cattle and a knack for management, and their herd grew steadily. They hired a hand to help with the work, a young man from town who was eager to learn ranching. Sarah added chickens and pigs to their homestead, and her garden expanded until she was growing enough vegetables to trade with neighbors. James grew into a toddler, then a little boy, curious and energetic and full of questions. He followed Colt everywhere, trying to help with the ranch work, and Colt was endlessly patient with him, teaching him how to handle the animals and care for the land. In the spring of 1882, Sarah gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Elizabeth. She was smaller than James had been, with wispy blonde hair and blue eyes that eventually turned hazel. Where James was boisterous and adventurous, Elizabeth was thoughtful and gentle, and she wrapped Colt around her little finger from the moment he first held her. "I am outnumbered now," Colt joked, looking at his wife and daughter with obvious adoration. "2 women in my house." "3, once Elizabeth grows up a bit," Sarah said with a smile. "You are going to have to learn to braid hair and pick wildflowers." "I will learn to do whatever my girls need," Colt said seriously, "just like I would do anything for my son. This family is everything to me, Sarah." Life was not always easy. There were harsh winters and dry summers, sick cattle and broken equipment, and all the challenges that came with running a ranch in the Arizona Territory. There were moments when money was tight and Sarah worried about making ends meet. There were times when Colt was injured working cattle or horses, and Sarah had to tend his wounds and pray they did not fester. But through it all, they had each other, and that made everything bearable. In 1884, when James was 4 and Elizabeth was 2, they welcomed another child, a son they named Thomas, after Sarah's first husband. It felt right to honor that man who had brought Sarah west, who had died in a dusty street and left her alone, but also, in a strange way, opened the door for everything that came after. Colt understood this without Sarah having to explain, and he held his second son with the same fierce love he showed all his children. 3 children, Colt said wonderingly, looking at his growing family. "We have 3 children, Sarah." "And a thriving ranch and a beautiful home," Sarah added. She looked around the house that Colt had built, which they had expanded twice now to accommodate their growing family. The walls were covered with drawings the children had made, and toys littered the floor, and the sound of laughter echoed through the rooms regularly. "We have everything we ever wanted." That summer, Mr. McCready passed away peacefully in his sleep, and Colt served as one of the pallbearers at the funeral. Mrs. McCready decided to sell the ranch and move to California to live with her daughter, and she stopped by to say goodbye to Sarah and Colt before she left. "I'm so proud of you both," she said, embracing Sarah and then Colt. "Look at what you have built here. Look at your family. This is what I hoped for you." "We could not have done it without your help," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "You gave me a job when I needed one. You gave us the loan for the land. You believed in us." "I believed in love," Mrs. McCready said, "and I was right to. You two are proof that sometimes the hardest things lead to the most beautiful outcomes." After Mrs. McCready left, Sarah stood in her kitchen and thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about Thomas dying in the street, about walking through the rain with ruined mending, about a stranger on a horse who smelled like cedar and rain. She thought about falling in love despite her fear, about choosing happiness, about building a life from nothing. "What are you thinking about, Sears?" Colt asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist just like he had that evening when she told him about the baby. "About cedar and rain," Sarah said, leaning back against him. "About how you told me you never recovered from either." "I never did," Colt said, kissing her temple, "and I never will." The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and family. The children grew and the ranch prospered. James developed his father's skill with horses and spent hours in the corrals training the colts they raised. Elizabeth showed a talent for drawing and would sit for hours with a pencil and paper capturing the landscape around their home. Thomas was the dreamer of the family, always asking questions about the world beyond their valley, reading every book he could get his hands on. In 1887, Sarah gave birth to one last child, another daughter they named Rose. She came as a surprise when Sarah was 33 and had thought they were done having children, but Rose was a joy from the beginning. A happy baby who grew into a cheerful little girl who loved everyone and everything with abandon. "4 children," Colt said, holding Rose in the rocking chair he had made when James was born. "We have 4 children, Sarah. We are blessed." "We are," Sarah agreed, watching her husband with their youngest child. Colt was 40 now, with streaks of gray in his dark hair and lines around his eyes from years of sun and wind. But he was still the same man who had helped her in the rain all those years ago, still strong and steady and filled with love for his family. The ranch continued to grow, too. They bought adjoining land when it became available, expanding their holdings and their herd. They built a proper barn and a bunkhouse for the hands they employed. The house was added onto again, sprawling across the creek side with multiple bedrooms and a large kitchen where Sarah cooked meals for the family and whatever hands were working that day. Sarah never went back to working for someone else. She had her hands full with the children and the household, and she found satisfaction in building their home and their life. But she always made time to read, to keep learning, to be more than just a ranch wife and mother. Colt encouraged this, bringing her books from town and discussing what she read with genuine interest. The children grew up strong and healthy, shaped by the land and their parents' love. James became a skilled rancher, helping Colt run the operation and eventually taking over more and more of the daily work. Elizabeth married a school teacher from Prescott when she was 19, a kind young man who appreciated her artistic nature and her intelligence. They settled in town but visited the ranch often, and Elizabeth gave Sarah her first grandchild in 1893. Thomas surprised everyone by deciding to become a doctor. He went east for his education, writing long letters home about his studies and the cities he lived in. But he always came back to Arizona for the summers, unable to stay away from the mountains and sky of his childhood. Rose, the baby, grew up to be as cheerful and loving as she had been from birth. She had a gift with animals and could gentle the wildest horse with patience and affection. She spent hours in the barn, caring for the stock, and Colt joked that she was more cowboy than some of the men he employed. In the spring of 1895, Sarah and Colt celebrated their 17th wedding anniversary. The children threw them a party at the ranch, inviting neighbors and friends from town. There was food and music and dancing, just like there had been at their wedding reception all those years ago. At one point in the evening, Colt pulled Sarah away from the crowd and walked with her down to the creek where they had built their home. The cottonwood trees had grown tall over the years, and the sound of water over stones was constant and soothing. "Do you remember when we first saw this place?" Colt asked, taking Sarah's hand in his. "I remember thinking it was the most beautiful spot I had ever seen," Sarah said. "I remember thinking we could build something here." "We did," Colt said, gesturing back toward the house where light spilled from the windows and laughter drifted on the evening air. "We built all of this, Sarah, together." "Together," Sarah echoed. She looked at her husband, at this man who had been her savior and her partner and her great love. His hair was more gray than dark now, and his face was deeply lined, but his eyes were still the same storm cloud gray that had captivated her that first day. "I love you," she said simply. "I have loved you from the moment you told me I smelled like cedar and rain." Colt smiled, that same transformative smile that never failed to make her heart skip. "And I have loved you from the moment I saw you kneeling in the mud in that storm. You were so determined to hold yourself together, so strong even when you were breaking. I knew right then that you were the woman I had been waiting for my whole life." He pulled her close and kissed her, and even after 17 years of marriage, it still felt like that first kiss on the porch of her little cabin still made her breath catch and her pulse race. "Cedar and rain," Colt whispered against her lips. "I still smell it on you, and I still have not recovered." "I hope you never do," Sarah said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. They walked back to the house hand in hand, back to their children and grandchild and the life they had built together in the high country of Arizona. The party continued into the night, and at one point Sarah stood back and just watched, her children laughing and dancing, her grandchild sleeping peacefully in Elizabeth's arms, her husband talking with friends and neighbors who had become like family over the years. This was what she had survived for, she realized. When Thomas died in that street, when she knelt in the mud in the rain with ruined mending, when she had been broke and alone and terrified, some part of her must have known that this was waiting. This love, this family, this home built on cedar-covered mountains where rainstorms swept through and wildflowers bloomed and the sky went on forever. The years continued to unfold, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. James married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread and gave Sarah more grandchildren. Thomas finished his medical training and opened a practice in Prescott, serving the community with skill and compassion. Rose eventually married one of the ranch hands, a quiet man who loved her fierce spirit and matched her skill with horses. They built a small house on the far side of the property and raised their own family there, keeping the ranch in the family for another generation. Elizabeth's artistic talent grew, and she began selling her drawings to magazines back east, images of the West that captured the harsh beauty of the landscape and the people who lived there. She never forgot where she came from, and her art always reflected the love she had for the land and her family. Sarah and Colt grew older together, their hair turning silver, their bodies slowing down, but their love never wavering. They spent more time on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains, holding hands, and remembering all the years that had brought them to this place. "Do you have any regrets?" Colt asked one evening in the summer of 1900, as they sat together watching the sky turn orange and pink and purple. Sarah thought about the question carefully. She thought about Thomas, about the life she might have had if he had not died. She thought about the hardships she had endured, the losses she had suffered, but then she looked at Colt, at this man who had been her partner for over 20 years now, and she shook her head. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Everything that happened, even the hard things, led me to you, led me to this life, and I would not change any of it." "Not even the rain and the ruined mending?" Colt teased gently. Sarah laughed, the sound still as bright as it had been when she was young. "Especially not that. If it had not rained that day, if I had not been kneeling in the mud, you might have just ridden past. And where would we be then?" "Lost," Colt said simply. "I would still be lost without you." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the house behind them, they could hear the voices of grandchildren playing, the sound of their adult children talking and laughing. The ranch stretched out around them, the land they had claimed and tamed and loved for more than 2 decades. "Cedar and rain," Sarah said softly, not really to Colt, but to the night and the mountains and the life they had built. "I still smell it too, you know. Every time the storms roll through, every time I walk through the cedar breaks. And it always makes me think of that day, that moment when everything changed." "The best moment of my life," Colt said, "meeting you." "The beginning of mine," Sarah replied. In the fall of 1903, Sarah and Colt celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. Their children threw them an even bigger party than the one for their 17th, with people coming from all over the territory to celebrate with the couple, who had become something of a legend in the area. Everyone knew the story of how they met, how Sarah had been widowed and alone, how Colt had helped her in a storm and fallen in love with the way she smelled like cedar and rain. It had become one of those stories people told when they talked about true love, about finding happiness in unexpected places, about building something beautiful from the ashes of loss. Young couples would ask Sarah and Colt for advice, and they always said the same things: choose happiness, work hard together, never stop choosing each other, and remember that love is not just a feeling but a decision you make every single day. Sarah was 50 now, and Colt was 52. They were both still healthy and active, though Sarah's dark hair was completely silver now and Colt moved a bit slower than he used to, but they still held hands every evening on the porch. They still kissed goodbye every morning when Colt headed out to work. They still looked at each other with the same love and desire that had brought them together all those years ago. At the anniversary party, after all the speeches and toasts were made, after the dancing and the food and the celebration, Sarah found herself standing alone for a moment on the edge of the crowd. She was watching Colt talk to one of their grandchildren, showing the little boy how to properly hold a rope, and she felt her heart swell with so much love she thought it might burst. Rose came to stand beside her, following her mother's gaze. "You and Papa are lucky," she said, "finding each other the way you did. Having a love like yours." "Luck had something to do with it," Sarah agreed, "but mostly it was choice. I chose to let myself love again after I lost Thomas. Your father chose to take a chance on a grieving widow with nothing to her name. We chose each other every day for 25 years. That is what made the difference. I hope I have what you and Papa have someday," Rose said wistfully. She was 18 now, engaged to her young ranch hand, planning a wedding for the spring. "You will," Sarah said confidently. "You come from love, Rose. You were raised in it. You know what it looks like, what it feels like, what it should be. And you have chosen a good man who will work beside you and choose you every day just like your father has chosen me." Rose hugged her mother tightly. "Thank you for showing us what love should be. All of us. We are lucky to have you and Papa as examples." Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, Sarah and Colt stood together in their bedroom, the room they had shared for 25 years. Colt helped Sarah out of her party dress, his fingers fumbling slightly with the buttons, and Sarah laughed softly at his concentration. 25 years and you still have trouble with buttons," she teased. 25 years and you still take my breath away," Colt countered, pulling her into his arms once the dress fell away. They made love that night with the tenderness and familiarity of long partnership, knowing exactly how to please each other, taking their time, because they had learned that the journey was just as important as the destination. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the sheets, and Sarah traced patterns on Colt's chest, following the scars and the lines of muscle and bone that she knew as well as her own body. "Do you remember what you said to me?" Sarah asked, "the day you first told me you had feelings for me?" "That you smelled like cedar and rain when we met, and I had never recovered from either," Colt recited immediately. "How could I forget? It was the truest thing I had ever said." "It is still true, is it not?" Sarah asked, "after 25 years?" Colt rolled onto his side to face her, his gray eyes serious in the moonlight coming through the window. "It will always be true, Sarah. I will never recover from you. Not in this lifetime or any other. You are the air I breathe, the ground I stand on, the reason I wake up every morning grateful to be alive." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, happy tears, overwhelmed tears. "I feel the same way about you. You saved me, Colt. Not just from poverty and loneliness, but from a half-life. Before you, I never knew what it meant to truly love someone with every part of myself. You taught me that." "We taught each other," Colt said softly. He kissed her forehead, her eyelids, her nose, her lips. "And we will keep teaching each other for however many years we have left." "Many years," Sarah said firmly. "We have grandchildren to watch grow up. We have great-grandchildren to meet someday. We have so much living left to do." "Then we will do it together," Colt said, "just like we have done everything else." The years that followed bore out Sarah's prediction. They did have many more years together, years filled with joy and purpose. They watched their grandchildren grow and their great-grandchildren arrive. The ranch continued to prosper under James's management, eventually becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. Thomas's medical practice thrived, and he became one of the most respected doctors in Arizona. Elizabeth's art was featured in galleries back east, and she became known for her authentic depictions of Western life. Rose and her husband expanded the horse breeding operation on the ranch, producing some of the finest stock in the region. Sarah and Colt settled into the role of patriarch and matriarch of their growing family, offering wisdom and love and support to all their descendants. They were fixtures at family gatherings, always sitting close together, always holding hands, always looking at each other with love that had not dimmed one bit, despite the passing decades. In the spring of 1910, Arizona officially became a state, and Colt and Sarah celebrated along with everyone else in the territory. They had lived through the transformation of the West, had seen the wild frontier become settled and civilized, had been part of building something permanent in a landscape that had once seemed impossibly harsh. "We helped build a state," Colt said wonderingly, reading the newspaper account of the statehood ceremony. "Our children and grandchildren are citizens of Arizona now, not just residents of a territory." "We built more than that," Sarah said. "We built a family, a legacy, a life that will continue long after we are gone." She was 56 now, and Colt was 58. They were both still relatively healthy, though Colt's knees bothered him on cold mornings, and Sarah had developed a cough that winter that had not entirely gone away, but they refused to slow down, refused to accept that they were getting old. That summer, they took a trip back to Pennsylvania, the first time Sarah had returned since leaving with Thomas over 30 years earlier. She wanted to show Colt where she had grown up, wanted to see if anything remained of her old life. They traveled by train, a luxury that would have been unimaginable when Sarah first came west. The town had changed, grown larger and more prosperous, but Sarah found the house where she had lived as a child. It was smaller than she remembered, shabbier, and occupied by a family she did not know. They stood on the street looking at it, and Sarah felt a strange disconnect, as if that young girl who had lived there was someone else entirely. "It is not home anymore," she said to Colt. "Home is Arizona. Home is our ranch, our family, the mountains and the storms and the cedar breaks. Home is wherever you are." They cut their trip short and returned to Arizona after only 2 weeks, both of them relieved to be back in the high country they loved. The moment they crested the ridge and saw their valley spread out below them, saw the house and the barns and the grazing cattle, Sarah felt something settle in her chest. "We are home," she said, and Colt squeezed her hand in agreement. The years continued to pass, each one precious, each one filled with the small moments that made up a life well lived. There were family dinners and holidays, births and weddings and funerals, good years and hard years, but through it all, Sarah and Colt remained each other's constants. In the winter of 1915, Colt fell from a horse and broke his hip. He was 64 years old, and the injury was serious. Sarah tended him through the painful recovery, sitting beside his bed day and night, reading to him and bringing him meals and helping him with the humiliating necessities of being bedridden. "You do not have to do this," Colt said one afternoon, his face gray with pain despite the laudanum the doctor had left. "We have children who could help." "Hush," Sarah said firmly. "You took care of me when I had nothing. You have taken care of me every day for over 30 years. Let me take care of you now." The hip healed slowly, and Colt walked with a limp afterward, but he recovered. He could no longer do the heavy ranch work, but he could still ride and supervise and make the decisions that kept the operation running smoothly. Sarah was grateful every day that they had not lost him, that he was still here, still hers. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in December of 1919. The party was smaller this time, just family, because many of their old friends had passed away and Sarah and Colt were both feeling their age. But it was no less joyful, no less filled with love. That night, lying in bed together, Colt turned to Sarah and said, 40 years. We have been married for 40 years. The best 40 years of my life," Sarah said, "every single day of them." "Even the hard ones?" Colt asked. "Especially the hard ones," Sarah said, "because we faced them together, because you were beside me through all of it." "I will always be beside you," Colt promised, "for as long as I draw breath." In the spring of 1921, Sarah fell ill with pneumonia. The cough that had bothered her for years suddenly worsened, and within days she was bedridden with fever and struggling to breathe. The doctor came from town and did what he could, but pneumonia was serious, especially for someone Sarah's age. She was 67, and her body had been worn down by years of hard work in the harsh Arizona climate. Colt refused to leave her side. He sat in a chair beside their bed holding her hand, talking to her even when she was too fevered to respond. Their children came to visit, bringing the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and the house was filled with family, all of them praying that Sarah would recover. On the 5th day of her illness, the fever broke, and Sarah opened her eyes to find Colt asleep in the chair beside the bed, still holding her hand. She squeezed his fingers weakly, and he woke instantly, his tired face breaking into a smile of pure relief. "You came back," he said hoarsely. "I thought I was losing you." "Not yet," Sarah whispered, her voice raw from coughing. "I am not done with you yet, Colt Brennan." She recovered slowly, but recover she did. By summer she was up and moving around again, though she tired easily, and the cough never entirely went away. The doctor warned that another bout of pneumonia would likely kill her, and Colt became obsessive about making sure she stayed warm and dry and rested. "I am fine," Sarah insisted one afternoon, as Colt hovered over her with yet another blanket. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met," Colt said, but his eyes were filled with love, not exasperation. "And you love me for it," Sarah said. "I love you despite it," Colt corrected. "No, that is not true. I love you because of it. I love everything about you, Sarah. Your stubbornness, your strength, your kindness, your laugh. Every single part of you." "Cedar and rain," Sarah said softly, the phrase that had become their shorthand for everything they felt for each other. "Cedar and rain," Colt echoed, leaning down to kiss her gently. They had 5 more years together, 5 precious years of watching their family continue to grow, of sitting on the porch in the evenings and remembering all the years behind them. They talked about everything and nothing, about the past and the present, about all the moments that had brought them to this place. Colt died peacefully in his sleep in October of 1926 at the age of 75. Sarah woke one morning to find him still and cold beside her, his face peaceful, his hand still reaching toward where she had lain. The grief was overwhelming, a physical pain that made it hard to breathe, hard to think, but even through the tears, Sarah was grateful. Grateful that he had not suffered. Grateful for the 47 years they had shared. Grateful that she had been given the gift of his love. The funeral was attended by seemingly everyone in the state of Arizona. Colt had become a legend in his own time, known for his skill as a rancher, his integrity as a businessman, and his devotion to his family. But to Sarah, he was simply the man who had helped her in a rainstorm, who had told her she smelled like cedar and rain, who had loved her with unwavering constancy for nearly 5 decades. After the funeral, Sarah moved in with James and his wife, unable to stay in the house she had shared with Colt without him, but she insisted on visiting the ranch often, walking down to the creek where they had built their first home, sitting on the porch where they had spent countless evenings together. One afternoon in the spring of 1927, Sarah walked to the creek alone. She was 73 years old, her body frail and her movements slow, but she made the journey because she needed to feel close to Colt. She sat on the bank where the cottonwood trees grew, listening to the water run over stones, and she closed her eyes and breathed deeply. There it was, that scent of cedar and rain, carried on the afternoon breeze as clouds built over the mountains. It always reminded her of him, always would. She could almost feel him beside her, could almost hear his voice telling her that he had never recovered from either. "I never recovered either," she said aloud, though there was no one there to hear. "I loved you from the moment we met until the moment you died, and I will love you until I join you. Cedar and rain, Colt. Cedar and rain." The first drops of rain began to fall, and Sarah tipped her face up to the sky and let them wash over her. She felt at peace for the first time since Colt had died, felt a certainty that he was not truly gone, that some essential part of him lived on in this land, in their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in the ranch they had built together, in the love story they had written with their lives. Sarah lived for 2 more years, dying quietly in her sleep in June of 1929 at the age of 75. She was buried beside Colt on the hillside above their ranch, where wildflowers grew, and the view stretched out over the valley they had claimed and loved. Their graves were marked with a single stone that bore both their names and a simple inscription that one of their grandchildren had suggested: "You smelled like cedar and rain when we met, and I never recovered from either." The ranch remained in the family for generations, passed down from James to his children and grandchildren. The house they had built was eventually turned into a museum, preserving the story of Sarah and Colt and the life they had created in the Arizona high country. Every year, on their anniversary, the family gathered at the ranch to remember them, to tell stories about their great love, to celebrate the legacy they had left behind. And when the summer storms rolled through the mountains, when the rain fell on the cedar trees and the scent of wet earth filled the air, the family always remembered Sarah and Colt. They remembered a widowed woman who had been brave enough to love again. They remembered a cowboy who had helped a stranger in the rain and found his soulmate. They remembered a love that had endured hardship and loss and time itself, a love that had built something beautiful and lasting in the wilderness. They remembered cedar and rain, and how 2 people who should never have met found each other on a stormy afternoon and created a legacy that would outlive them both. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth celebrating. It was proof that love could bloom in the most unexpected places, that happiness could be found even after devastating loss, that 2 people who chose each other every single day could build something that would last forever. The ranch still stands in the Arizona high country, in a valley where wildflowers bloom and cattle graze, and the mountains rise up purple against the endless sky. And when the afternoon thunderstorms sweep through, when the rain falls on the cedar trees and fills the air with that clean, wild scent, those who know the story of Sarah and Colt always pause and remember. They remember a love that began with rain and cedar, a love that survived everything life threw at it, a love that proved that sometimes the most beautiful things come from the most unexpected moments. They remember that a cowboy once told a widow she smelled like cedar and rain when they met, and that he had never recovered from either. And they remember that she loved him right back just as fiercely, just as completely, creating a love story for the ages in the wild and beautiful West.